Welcome to Critical Aspects of Law Enforcement, a podcast where we dive into the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being of the law enforcement officer.
Minor injury accident in the 2700 block of 156th Avenue Northeast.
All right, welcome back to Critical Aspects of Law Enforcement. I'm your host, Vernon Phillips, and today on the show we've got John Jones. So he's going to share a little bit about himself, just a little bit about his background, his history, kind of what he's doing now. So, John, I appreciate you coming on. I want you to go ahead and just give us a little bit about yourself.
All right, thank you, sir. 30 plus years in the military and first responder field. Went in the military back in January 92. I was a Navy corpsman, FMF. Went to Somalia with the Marines. After just under 7 years in the military, got into local law enforcement, was able to catapult that or use that to get into federal law enforcement. And most recently, I retired as a senior federal air marshal. Retired in January of 2023. So now after being retired for a while, got bored and I got my insurance license, and now I'm working in the insurance and financial services field.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your service, and thank you for what you've done. So, being an air marshal, I'm sure that was pretty demanding. Probably a lot of interesting stories you can share on that. But throughout your career, military, being an air marshal, what did you do to make sure that you were taking care of yourself? So, what did you do to take care of yourself, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually?
I was raised in a very strong Christian household. The whole praying mother, which was very, very helpful, which when I was younger, I didn't necessarily understand the benefit of that. Right.
Yeah. Yep.
But I come from a very large family as well. I have 7 sisters and 2 brothers.
Wow.
All biological. So that aspect as well. Several of my siblings were full-time missionaries, and but it wasn't until later in life where I really developed my own faith, not just from being raised in church, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah.
But with them, it was a lot of working out, a lot of physical activity. The benefit of physical activity should not be discarded in the first responder field or the military. You've got the physiological responses for that is tremendous. But really, the biggest thing though was, especially as being an air marshal, is my wife. The stability of having my wife at home, raising the kids, and knowing that when I came home from wherever it was that I was coming home from, that she would be there, that that stability was there.
Absolutely. And I want to touch on that real quick, but first, you said that having growing up in a Christian home, being part of a large family, I can totally relate to that. I grew up in a Christian home. I'm the youngest of 6, not quite as large as yours, but
Right.
But I understand that. But also, my mom, she was a prayer warrior. I mean, she was. There was a lot of things that she felt she couldn't do for people, because of her disability. But one thing that she could do, man, is she could pray. And if you had something going on, she would be praying for you. Or if you were involved in something that she didn't want you involved in, you could be sure she was going to be praying for you for sure.
Right. Right.
But and just like you, I mean, growing up at the time, you don't really appreciate that until you get older, and you really see how much being raised in that environment is just beneficial to just your overall outlook on life, and just how you've been, how you are brought up, and kind of shapes who you are and your worldview. So I look back and I'm super appreciative of my family, my parents.
Right.
So, but
Yeah.
one thing you did talk about, you said about having the support of your wife.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that's something we don't really talk enough about in the law enforcement, first responder, military realm, is the family dynamic and the importance of the relationship that you have with your spouse, right? Your significant other.
Right.
And that is huge. I mean, it's got to be teamwork, right? For myself, my wife stays home with our 4 kids. We homeschool. She has got the harder job by far.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I don't know how she does it. She is an absolute, a machine. And I don't say that in any type of,
Right.
derogatory way. I mean, she's just,
right.
she's just fantastic in what
Right.
she's able to do and achieve, especially with our kids. So that is a huge dynamic. So just kind of give us a little bit of idea of like how you guys made that work. What were good things you guys did as far as like communicating, talking through things, and just really holding that, that marriage together, because that's a big thing.
It is. It's a huge thing. And so for us, we are actually both on our second marriages. Neither of us really came into our own faith until later. Ironically, shortly before we met each other. But because of our prior relationships, we really kind of sat down and said, hey, look, this is what we're not going to tolerate. This is what we're going to do in conflict. This is what we're going to do in, any like disagreements. We're not going to do this, and we will do this. We're not going to scream and yell and do any of that stuff. And we're not going to shut down and disregard or be distant or leave. We're going to sit down and we're going to calmly talk about the things as calmly as, not saying that we don't fight, but, we try to stick to these things. But it was based off of prior relationships that we came into this. So with law enforcement, I think specifically, you got to have those discussions on what you're going to tolerate and what you're not going to tolerate. But the law enforcement member or the first responder, the military member, needs to understand that the spouse actually wants to know what's going on, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, there may be certain aspects of that you leave out, maybe specific details or something like that, but they do want to know what's going on. They want to know what you're dealing with, and they're capable of handling that.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot that they don't want to impart on their significant other, their spouse. The things that they see, day in and day out in the profession, but that still doesn't negate the fact that they want to be included in your
Right.
life, right? They want to know the things that are bothering you. You don't have to go into the details, right? You don't have to describe the scene that you had worked that day or the things that you saw, but
Right.
they want to know how you are doing. And a lot of times what happens is, you come home and you shut down, right? And you don't talk, you don't communicate, and you self-medicate, and that translates to them at, oh, he doesn't want to be here, or she doesn't want to be here, right? They don't want to have any type of quality interaction, conversations, when that's not necessarily really what's going on. It's just that they're trying
Right.
to work through all the things that they've seen and been a part of, and they just really probably don't really know how to share that. But you don't have to, like you said, you don't have to share the details, but
Right.
they want to be included, right? They don't want to be
Right.
excluded. They don't want to be isolated, just like anybody in the first responder community or the military community. Like, they don't want to be isolated,
Right.
they want that, that community, and that's a lot of times what the significant others want. And something that you touched on, which I think is a huge deal, is you said, hey, that this we're on our second marriage, and that
Right.
happens a lot. But the difference is when you guys came into it, you said, hey, and you laid all the cards on the table and said, this is what we want to do. This is what we don't want to do, right? We want to be able to have discussions, and if we have arguments, we want to be able to do that constructively. We want to be able to do it in a way that
Right.
resolves whatever the topic of conversation is, whatever the disagreement is,
Right.
and we want to do it in a way that is respectful to each other, but also gives us the ability to build upon our marriage and move forward. So I don't want anybody to think that, if you're on, if you've had a separation, you're on your second marriage, or even beyond that just
Right.
means, okay, well, whatever, I guess I'm just going to throw it in. No,
Right.
you can move forward. You can have those conversations. You can build, and you can have a good, successful, marriage moving forward,
Right.
even if maybe the first one wasn't, right? So learn, apply what you've learned, and go into it. But communication's a big thing, and that's what you guys did, right? You sat down in the beginning, you laid
Yeah.
it out, and you said, okay,
Yeah.
hey, this is what we're both looking for. I mean, and I think that's an aspect that we leave out, is the communication.
Yeah, that's a really big aspect. And going back to that whole thing about talking to your spouse about the things that you're experiencing on the job, it's the same thing in your marriage. If you're on a second or third marriage or whatever it may be, we got to grow. We got to learn from our past and apply the things that we've learned from the past in order to make our future better. And if we
Yeah.
don't do that, we're going to end up doing the same, having the same situations continuously play out. And I'm not judging them, but I have friends, I have, former coworkers who are consistently, married, it goes bad really fast. They go through a bad divorce, and as soon as the divorce is over, they're back in another relationship, and cycling those negative things. So to stop that, you have to have the communication. You got to communicate.
Yeah. So what would be your advice to, to those just getting in the profession, and they're getting in the profession, and maybe they haven't sat down and had the conversation with, with their significant other, with their spouses, like, hey, this is what I'm getting into. This is what I'm going to be doing. What would be your suggestion for them as they kind of navigate their career and their relationship?
So my advice to anybody that's starting out, especially younger people getting into this profession who are in a relationship, is just that: sit down. You have an idea of what you're going to deal with, but you have no idea. The things that you're going to experience are going to be better than what you think they're going to be, and then there are going to be some that are way worse than what you're expecting. And it's the cumulative toll on that. So getting in this, when you're younger, talking to your spouse and just laying that framework, this is what I will tell you. If I go above what you're comfortable with, let me know, and I'll scale that back, but I'm not going to shut you out completely. Right. So it's learning that balance of what the spouse can tolerate, and also what you're comfortable sharing. Don't be afraid to share some of the more negative aspects of what you're experiencing, but also don't don't use that as a blanket. I'm just going to vent. I'm going to yell. I'm going to do something. You need to do it, as a rational, mature adult. So
Yeah. No, that's good sound advice. I mean, it all just stems from communication. I mean, it stems from being able
exactly.
to effectively communicate with each other, because they don't know what you're thinking and you don't know what they're thinking, right? So to alleviate those frustrations, to alleviate any type of misconceptions or those little lies that the devil will feed, during those
Yeah.
times where there's just miscommunication, is talking, right? Having
Yeah.
that good quality communication where you're sharing your thoughts, your feelings, your frustrations, your concerns, and then likewise for them. It really just helps to kind of to clear a lot of that confusion that comes up. That doesn't mean
Right.
that it's always going to be sunshine and rainbows, because if you've been
Yeah.
married, you know that it's not always sunshine and
Always
rainbows. There,
correct.
there's
Correct.
times where it's hard. Marriage is hard work,
It is.
and so make sure you're working those things out.
Right. Yeah.
So
If it wasn't hard, there would never be any divorce or second marriages.
no,
You know what I mean?
absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
yep,
So yeah, you gotta, just like going into a marriage, hopefully not thinking that it's going to end in divorce. Hopefully you're not going into a marriage like that. The first responder field, hopefully you're going into this knowing that, yes, you're doing this because you have this desire to help people and you want to make a difference within your community or whatever the reason why you're getting into it. But you also have to understand that it's going to be a toll. It's going to be a grind.
yeah,
It's going to be hard. But this is kind of what I talk about in the book that I have coming out. It's, you've been called into this, right? Most people don't stay in law enforcement or the first responder field without feeling like they've been called into it, right? So if you're a believer, which, probably if you're listening to this, you probably are. But if not, but if you feel like you've been called into this profession, then the one calling you will give you the tools to help you cope with this over the course of your career, right? You just got to be able to recognize what those tools are and accept that. That's one of the things about law enforcement or first responder field in general is we don't tend to think that we need the help. But
yeah,
absolutely we do, especially with what we see day in and day out. And,
yeah. No, absolutely. So with that, I mean, when we start looking at the profession and really preparing people, for one, I don't think we prepare them for relationship success at all,
no, not at
on
all.
any level. But kind of with that aside, do you think that in general that the community, that the law enforcement community, do you think that they prepare individuals coming in for the profession, for them to really thrive and succeed in their career? It's kind of a loaded question, I know.
It is a loaded question, and I'll just pull the trick. No, they don't. The coming into this profession, just like going through an academy, doesn't prepare you for what you're going to experience on your own on the street. They get you a basic understanding of what you're going to be dealing with long term.
Yeah.
And then the longer you're in this profession, the less they actually prepare you for what you're dealing with, because and when I say they, the general leadership, administration, what have you, they assume you're dealing with it because you're still showing up to work and you're still putting in your hours and you're doing your job. So they assume that you're doing fine. So it is a lot of questions, a catch-22, but as far as the basic coming into they don't do, I don't think there's that it's, but how are you going to make it to where the majority of people coming into law enforcement understand a longer term aspect of law enforcement when they don't understand what law enforcement actually entails?
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And I understand that to a degree, because, there's certain scenarios, certain situations you're going to get into throughout your career that they have no way to create some type of, mock scenario based out of that as you're coming in, as you go through the academy, or when you first, start out in your career. There's just no way to prepare you for every single thing you're ever going to encounter. But probably think doing a little bit more work on the forefront, just teaching people good communication skills with their family, their significant others, just kind of giving them a good overview of, hey, these are some of the things you're going to encounter. These are the way they're going to impact you. These are kind of some of the things that may come up, and kind of trying to just establish a good groundwork from there. But I mean, you were an air marshal. So I'm sure there's a lot of things that you encountered that you were not, you weren't prepared for, or that they didn't really say, hey, this is something you might deal with. So when you look back, over your career, what was one of the most difficult situations that you had to encounter and kind of work through?
Probably the most difficult situation in the law enforcement career was actually when I was a local deputy in Omaha. I was in Omaha, Nebraska, where I was, and I graduated the academy in April, and that October, so what, 5-6 months, whatever, later, I was within the first 3 or 4 deputies that responded to a school bus that had fallen 68 feet off of a bridge into a creek. Total mass casualty situation, kids, the parents, it was a band competition, regional band, high school bands that went to a regional competition, and the school bus was on its way back to their city, and there was a bridge the road was under construction, and ultimately the bus fell off of this 68 feet into a ravine. But just that chaotic, 4 kids died at the scene, and chaperone parents, and just that kind of mass casualty, mass trauma event being so quickly out of the academy, right? I was actually, if I remember correctly, I was just a month or 2 out of FTO, right? So this was like right when you're first getting into, doing some stuff, you're still excited, you're still raring to go. And I mean, it was, it was a bad day.
So how did you process through that? What did you do? What are some of the steps you took to kind of work through that call?
Well, so I had been a corpsman with the Marines, like I said. So I understood the traumatic medical part of it, but that wasn't my role. The fire department was there. There were paramedics were there, but I was assisting in any way that I could, CPR, and but during the event, you're actually just doing what you need to do to get it done. After the event, it was the first time where I had been forced into a debrief, where we actually had counselors come in and we had to talk, but it was an open room debrief. So there were a lot of people who, myself included, that didn't say anything. We were like, so dealing with that afterwards was really, that honestly, that's probably one of the things that I had gotten back into going to church. Um, I had, but I was still kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. That really, I think, helped push me into seeking, Christian guidance and, pursuing my faith. And so that's what actually I did. That's how I dealt with it. Several of the other um, officers did not deal with it that way. Um, so,
Yeah, and I think that's a component that does get left out. We talk a lot about the physical, right? We talk a lot about the mental. We even talk about the emotional, but sometimes we start talking about the spiritual aspect of the profession of just first responders, military. That one doesn't get quite as much attention as it probably should. Depending on who you talk to, they're gonna say that, hey, that's probably the most important one when it comes
right,
to just your ability to kind of go through different critical and traumatic events, and just your ability just to kind of see certain things, but be able just to kind of come out on the other side. So I think that we often don't talk about that a lot, but I mean, for me, my faith is a huge part of allowing me to be able to walk through certain things, right?
yeah,
It doesn't make it any easier, right? It doesn't change the fact that you could be dealing with something that's traumatic, but it does help you kind of process things on a whole different level, and
right.
it gives you that ability to kind of just to walk through some of that stuff.
Right. And like you said, it doesn't make the actual event easier or less traumatic, right?
Yeah,
But your ability to process it, I think, actually is significantly better. So you asked earlier about preparing new uh, people getting into this field. What can we do to help prepare them better? I think one of the best ways to do it is acknowledging faith-based um, groups, like whether, so for instance, the air marshals, a bunch of us got together and outside of government communication started what we called it the Flying Fellowship, and ended up just something that started locally in the LA office. Within like 2 years had 120 air marshals from all over the nation in this
Mhm.
group,
That's pretty cool.
supporting each other. You can send prayer requests, you can send praise, you know stuff like that. But it was completely through personal communication, personal emails, and stuff like that. And there was nothing officially recognized by the Air Marshal Service. um, but when anybody came in, there was, this core group would be like, hey, if you're religious, or, if you're a Christian, we have this group. If you want to join, just let us know. We'll add you in. When I was on the sheriff's department, there was nothing like that. There was nothing, even though there were Christian, like my sergeant went to the same church, so, but there was nothing officially recognized as far as a religious based law enforcement affiliation. I think there needs to be a resurgence of that at the local level and then at the federal level as well. And I know there's a lot of groups that do that. I was just never exposed to that, or told about that. And when I did when I got into law enforcement, like cell phones were just like the iPhone didn't even exist, right? So it wasn't the quick
Yeah,
communication and stuff like that, or Google wasn't a thing, right? So you couldn't look up stuff like that. Now those things do exist, so hopefully it'll be easier for newer people coming in to find the resources that are available to them. But even if there's nothing in their immediate area, there's people like Jeremy Wade with the First Alliance, First Responder Alliance, that are in the process of trying to facilitate Christian first responder groups to get the word out to people, and if you're a Christian and a first responder, don't be afraid to approach the new people and tell them that you are a Christian and that if they need that, you're there to mentor them.
Yeah, absolutely. And even with that, I mean, if you're an agency and like John said, if they don't have something like that, I mean, take the initiative and create something like that. I mean, that's pretty neat that just organically that, within the Air Marshal Service, that kind of came up and just kind of developed on its own. And that's really neat, because I think that, we need that fellowship, right? We need that brother and sisterhood, in the faith, to encourage one another, do life with each other, and just kind of continue to support one another. So that's pretty cool. That's neat to hear that, for sure.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it was kind of weird how it all started, but I mean, it started out in the LA office with like 5 of us that we knew. We had talked, we knew that we were Christian. Actually, one of the guys that was one of the founding members came into the Air Marshal Service after having been a full-time pastor. So everybody knew that, he was a Christian. He actually ended up leaving the Air Marshal Service to take a job working at a mission on Skid Row in LA. So he left a federal law enforcement with all the pay and benefits and everything associated with that to go work on Skid Row. Like, this guy,
wow,
phenomenal. Like, ironically, he's probably one of the most selfless guys I've ever met. That, like, he knocked out a guy in a red man suit. So he's selfless, but he can take you out if you need to. So that's another thing about being a Christian. Being a Christian in law enforcement or the first responder field, even though that's what people perceive it to be, it's the opposite of being weak or wimpy or, meek is not weak. Meekness is strength under control. And that's exactly what we're called to be. And that's what we need to be as Christian first responders. Yeah,
absolutely. So, well, I appreciate you sharing that, because that's a really good, critical component right there that we often don't talk about. So, right. But to kind of transition a little bit, so we talked a little bit about one of your more difficult calls. So, being in an air marshal, what is one of the funniest or most awkward things you had to deal with in your career there? I'm sure you've got a list of them, but yeah.
Well, funniest, it's hard to come up with like a specific funny. Probably the most awkward actually was, one of the most awkward was, I looked like this once I went into the Air Marshal Service, right? Air Marshals, I could wear T-shirts and jeans and, Chuck Taylors or whatever, baseball hat. My beard is actually trimmed now. I used to have it much longer. I look like a scumbag, and we were on a flight, a feeder flight going somewhere domestically. And then the next day we were going to go internationally from that location. And, one of the flight attendants just kept eyeballing me, just because I would stand up and I'd stand in the back and I'd kind of move around a little bit. And what I didn't know is some of the other air marshals in a different part of the plane were, they actually had known one of the flight attendants. So we were all invited to go out to dinner with the flight crew because nobody was local to the area we were going to. So, landed, did my workout, and got ready. We went out to eat dinner, and as the group of air marshals that were on, came walking into the restaurant, that the flight attendant that was eyeballing me for the entire flight starts just like almost belly laughing. She's like, I cannot believe you were one of the air marshals. It didn't even cross my mind. She said, I thought you were either a terrorist or had just been released from prison and were being sent back home. So I was like, well, I mean, if the flight attendant couldn't figure it out, I was like, hey, then I must be doing something right.
Well, isn't that the whole idea, right? To kind of blend in and kind of look like everybody else. I mean, maybe you take it a little bit too far to where you cause a little bit of unrest. That might that might kind of tweak the line there a little bit. But that is pretty funny.
Yeah.
You're there to kind of protect the flight, and she's looking at you thinking, what is this joker going to do on this flight?
Exactly. Right.
So that is pretty funny.
Yeah.
So, as we kind of start to wind down here, you're right now you're in the works of writing a book, right? And it's slated to come out here when?
So I actually wrote the book. I wrote the book in 2020, and it was picked up by a publishing group. But over the course of the last 3 years, it failed to be published. It was supposed to have been released in August. But through having to go back and I ended up getting my rights back, so the contract is now null and void. So I'm working with a not a publisher, but a international best-selling author who is helping get everything together for publication, and we're hoping to have it released and out available January of 2024.
Okay.
But so the book is specifically about, so it's called A Higher Calling, a biblical guide for first responders, military, and veterans. Basically, anybody who has to go out and anybody that goes out and confronts evil and sees the depravity of what people do to each other. What does the Bible say about your role in that? And so it's not a devotional book. It specifically addresses training, your personal relationships, your work relationships, trauma. What does the Bible say about you inflicting violence? And then it goes into, what happens now that you're done into retirement. What does that look like, still being called to serve, but not serve in the same potentially uniform capacity that you did before.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that sounds like a good resource. And we'll be looking for that to come out. And maybe once it does come out and it does, get pushed out, we'll bring you back on here so we can kind of showcase it a little bit. And we can to review it a little bit. But as we kind of wrap up, as you kind of look at where you're at now and everything that you've gone through, how much has your faith, and we've touched on this quite a bit, right? We've been kind of heavy on this, but how much has your faith in God played a part in where you are today?
I wouldn't be where I am today without it. It's just no questions at all. Even in those times where I didn't necessarily recognize my faith, I think that it was still there, but for sure, God was there. Absolutely, God was there, whether I was wanting him to be there or not. But without God, I wouldn't be where I am. I don't think my kids would be where they are. My spouse, she wouldn't be where she is. So as as a Christian man, right, that's leading your family in that faith. Did I do it perfectly? No, but we did it, right? So without God, I would not have what I have. I wouldn't have the resources available to me. I wouldn't, just because of how I kind of got hired into the Federal Air Marshal Service and things that were going on at that time, I actually would not have gotten into the Federal Air Marshal Service if it hadn't been specifically, ordained by God. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, John, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming on and, just taking the time just to give us a little bit of, background on yourself, just kind of talk through some different things, talk about marriage and communication and talk about, working through some of that hard stuff and, just sharing what you got coming out in your book. And, but man, I appreciate you coming on and just being a part.
I appreciate you letting me come on and talk about these things. Got the next generation of folks coming into the first responder field need a little bit better than what we got coming into it.
Yeah. And that's what it's all about is leaving things better than when we first came in. Right.
Absolutely. Yep.
And, as believers, we want to live for Christ in a world that tells us not to. And it seems like that's where we're at, man.
Absolutely. And that first responder world, it seems for whatever reason that, I don't know if it's the alpha personality, but it seems to, it almost seems harder in a way. I mean, like it's harder to live for Christ in, well, I don't want to say that because it sounds judgmental, but it seems to me, having worked at corporate as well, now that I'm doing insurance, it seems harder to work and do for God when you're, potentially having to, fight somebody, than it is to at an office where you talk to people in meetings and kind of. I'm trying not to say.
Yeah, no.
I know right now my wife is going to say you sounded like a judgmental jerk, but I'm not trying to. But it just seems like that alpha. Let's go after it. How can
It's the control, right? I'm the one in control.
Right.
I'm the one that has control over you, over the situation, over myself, over how I respond to things, and I don't need help.
Right.
It's kind of it's very much that that mentality, and sometimes we try to articulate what we want to say, but don't worry about it, man. I appreciate you. I appreciate what you share.
You know what I'm trying to say, and I'm not trying to be judgmental, whether I sound like it or not. I do have to say this. When I started working and being on the computer for a while, I actually had to go back to my wife and apologize to her because she's been she does IT and stuff like that. And I actually had to apologize and say, look, I'm sorry I was so condescending about your office job for all these years, because it's hard. It's hard sitting there looking at a computer all day long. And for those of you that are out there doing that, more power to you. But yeah, so hopefully I redeem myself, right?
Oh, no, you're good, man. All right, John, I appreciate it. Thanks again.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
All right, you too.
I appreciate you tuning in and listening to Critical Aspects of Law Enforcement. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and share this resource with your fellow officers. The goal of Critical Aspects is to serve, support, and sustain the law enforcement professionals. So head over to www.criticalaspects.org for more resources and information. And as always, God bless and be safe.